There is something profoundly fascinating about people who grew up during the 1970s. We're not just talking about nostalgic memories or a distant era in the past. We're talking about lasting psychological characteristics, behavioral patterns that were shaped by a unique moment in human history. The 1970s was a period of monumental transition, an era suspended between the naive optimism of the post-war period and the accelerated complexity of the modern world we know today. And those who lived their childhood and adolescence in those years carry distinctive psychological marks that define them to this day. To understand who these people are, we first need to understand the world in which they grew up. The 1970s were marked by profound contradictions. It was a time of growing freedom, but also economic uncertainties. It was a time of technological innovation, but still strongly anchored in direct human contact. The children of this decade were born into a world that had not yet been dominated by digital technology, where imagination needed to fill the spaces that today are occupied by screens and algorithms. They grew up playing in the streets until nightfall, with more freedom of movement than became the norm in subsequent generations. They knew the freedom to explore, to experiment, and learn from direct experience. Before we continue this fascinating journey through the psychological universe of this extraordinary generation, I'd like to make a simple request. If you're enjoying this content, subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments the time you're watching this video. It's always interesting to know when you're here with us. Now, let's dive deeply into the characteristics that psychologically define those who grew up in the 1970s. The first notable characteristic is a particular resilience, an adaptive capacity that was forged through direct experience with the physical world. These children didn't have instant access to information or entertainment. If they wanted to have fun, they needed to create their own games. If they wanted to know something, they needed to go to a library or ask someone in person. This process of active searching developed in them a notable determination and creativity for problem solving. They learned early on that the world doesn't deliver ready-made answers, that you need to go after them, explore, try, fail, and try again. This generation also developed a very particular relationship with time. In the 1970s, time was slower, more tangible. A letter took days to reach its recipient. A long-distance phone call was a planned, expensive event that required you to get straight to the point. Photographs were limited by the number of exposures on the film, and you only saw the result days after developing. This relationship with time created in people of that era a patience and capacity for waiting that developed differently from later generations. They learned that good things take time, that processes cannot be accelerated indefinitely, that there is value in anticipation and waiting. Another striking psychological trait is the emotional and physical independence that was cultivated in these children. The parents of the 1970s, many of them children of World War II or the Reconstruction decades that followed, had a different parenting philosophy. They believed that children needed freedom to explore, to learn from their own mistakes. There was no modern concept of helicopter parents, always hovering and protecting. Children left home in the morning and returned when it got dark, and nobody questioned much what they did in the meantime. They climbed trees, built huts, explored vacant lots, invented elaborate games with their own rules. And through these experiences, they learned to assess risks, develop caution, and gain confidence through broadly supervised exploration. This experience of independence created adults with a strong capacity for emotional self-regulation. They learned to process their feelings without the constant need for external validation. They learned that not every frustration needs to be immediately resolved by an adult, that some problems they could solve themselves, that conflicts between friends could be negotiated without superior intervention. This experience of emotional autonomy from an early age results in people who, in adult life, tend to be more self-confident, less dependent on constant approval, more capable of dealing with adversities. The 1970s was also a period of great social and cultural experimentation. It was the hangover from the revolutionary movements of the 1960s, but there was still in the air a spirit of questioning, of searching for alternatives, of rejecting rigid structures. Children absorbed this zeitgeist in subtle but profound ways. They grew up watching their parents and society questioning traditions, experimenting with new ways of living, challenging established authorities. This created in them a more flexible, less dogmatic mentality, more open to different perspectives. At the same time, having grown up before the extreme fragmentation of cultural identities that the internet would bring, they maintained a sense of shared culture, of common references that united different social groups. Television in the 1970s was a completely different phenomenon from what it is today. There were few channels, and families often watched the same programs together. This created a genuine mass culture phenomenon, where millions of people shared the same media experiences simultaneously. At school the next day, everyone had seen the same program, and this became part of the collective conversation. This shared experience created in people of this generation a particular capacity for social connection, an understanding that they are part of something larger, of a collective narrative. They developed social skills through constant face-to-face interaction, not mediated by screens or digital filters. Speaking of social interaction, children of the 1970s developed a remarkable ability to read facial expressions, body language, and voice tones. All their communication was in person or, at most, by landline phone where there was only voice. There were no emojis to clarify intentions, there was no way to edit what you had just said, you couldn't Google what to respond in a difficult conversation. You needed to be present, attentive, capable of interpreting nuances and responding in real time. This developed in them emotional and social intelligence through constant face-to-face communication. Music played a particularly important role in the psychological formation of this generation. The 1970s were a golden age for popular music, with a diversity of genres exploding simultaneously. Progressive rock, disco, funk, punk, soul, all coexisted and influenced each other. Children listened to music in a very different way from today. You bought a vinyl record, took it home, and listened to the entire album, from beginning to end, in the order the artist had planned. There was no shuffle, there were no algorithmic playlists. You committed to that complete musical experience, read the lyrics printed on the cover, studied the artwork, knew those records deeply because they were precious and limited. This relationship with music developed in these people a capacity for sustained attention, an appreciation for the complete work instead of fragments, a respect for artistic intention. Economically, the 1970s were turbulent. The oil crisis, rising inflation, the end of unlimited post-war economic optimism. Children of that time often saw their parents dealing with financial uncertainties, with recessions, with the need to tighten their belts. This created in them a mentality of valuing resources, of not wasting, of making things last, of repairing instead of replacing. They learned that you can't always have everything you want immediately, that sometimes you need to wait, save, prioritize. This informal education about scarcity and value created adults generally more conscious about resource use and capable of distinguishing between needs and wants. Education in the 1970s also had particular characteristics that shaped the psychology of these children. Schools were more rigid in terms of discipline, but paradoxically more open in terms of allowing children to be children. There were long recesses, vigorous physical education, and a different pace of academic pressure. Children had time to be bored, and from boredom came creativity. They had time to simply play, and from this free play emerged social skills, creativity, and self-regulation. Another fundamental aspect is that children of the 1970s grew up in an analog world. They developed fine motor skills through practical activities. They learned to tie shoes, to write by hand with legible handwriting, to use tools, to build things with their hands. This constant engagement with the physical world developed not only practical skills but also important neural connections between abstract thought and concrete manifestation. They understood that ideas need to become real through work and skill, that there is a distance between imagining something and making it exist, and that crossing that distance requires effort, practice, and persistence. The experience of growing up without the internet, without cell phones, without instant communication, created in these people a particular capacity to be present in the moment. When you were with someone, you were really with that person. When you were in a place, you were actually there, observing, absorbing, creating memories. This full presence developed a capacity for attention and deep connection. People who grew up in the 1970s also developed a particular relationship with privacy and personal exposure. They grew up in an era where their personal life was truly private, where embarrassing moments weren't filmed and shared globally, where you could make mistakes and learn from them without them being permanently recorded on the internet. This created a psychological freedom to experiment, to err, to discover who you are through trial and error. These people developed a relationship with privacy that values authenticity without constant exposure. There is also a trait of pragmatism and adaptability that marks this generation. They lived in a world that changed dramatically during their lives. They were born in the analog era and had to learn to navigate the digital world as adults. They saw communication evolve from letters to landline phones to cell phones to smartphones. They saw research go from encyclopedias to libraries to the internet. They saw work transform radically. This constant need to learn new technologies and adapt to new paradigms developed in them a remarkable mental flexibility. They aren't afraid of change because they've been through so many fundamental transformations that they know they can adapt. There also exists in this generation a certain constructive nostalgia, not a paralyzing nostalgia that idealizes the past and rejects the present, but a capacity to recognize what was valuable in simpler experiences, in slower rhythms, in deeper connections. They can appreciate the conveniences of modern technology while maintaining a critical awareness of what was lost in the process. This dual perspective, this capacity to value both the old and the new, often makes them important cultural mediators, capable of translating between older and younger generations. People of that era also developed a strong work ethic and a belief in social mobility through effort. They grew up at a time when it still seemed possible that hard work and dedication would result in economic and social progress. Their parents were often living examples of this, having built stable lives through constant work. This belief was tested by the economic realities of subsequent decades, but left a deep mark on the psychology of these people. They tend to value perseverance, personal responsibility, fulfillment of commitments, integrity in work. There is an interesting spiritual and philosophical dimension in this generation as well. They grew up at a time of great religious and spiritual questioning. The 1970s saw the emergence of New Age movements, growing Western interest in Eastern philosophies, experimentation with different forms of spirituality. At the same time, many maintained connections with established religious traditions. This created an openness to spiritual exploration combined with, often, a healthy skepticism toward rigid dogmas. These people tend to have a more individualized, more experimental, more eclectic spirituality. The relationship with nature is also characteristic of this generation. Children of the 1970s spent a lot of time outdoors. They climbed trees, swam in rivers and lakes, explored forests, went camping. This direct and constant connection with the natural world developed not only physical health but also a visceral ecological awareness, an intuitive understanding that we are part of larger natural systems. Many of the environmental movements would later be led or strongly supported by people of this generation, who brought not only intellectual arguments but a deep emotional connection with nature formed in childhood. There is also a characteristic of practical self-confidence in this generation. They learned to do things themselves because there was no YouTube tutorial for everything. If the bicycle broke, you learned to fix it. If you wanted to build something, you figured out how. If you needed to go somewhere, you learned to read maps and find the way. This constant need to solve practical problems developed a self-confidence that comes from real experience, not external validation. These people know they are capable because they've proven to themselves countless times that they can figure out how to do things, overcome obstacles, learn new skills. Friendship had a different and profound meaning for children of the 1970s. Without social networks, without instant messages, friendships were cultivated through shared face-to-face time. You really knew your friends, spent hours talking, sharing experiences. Friendships were often deeper due to the amount of face-to-face time invested. You had your neighborhood friends, your school friends, and these relationships were intense and formative. This experience created people who value depth in relationships and understand that true friendship requires investment of time and energy. There is also a particular political and social consciousness in this generation. They grew up watching the social movements of the 1960s and 1970s actually change societies. They saw civil rights being won, they saw women's movements transform gender expectations, they saw pacifist movements influence foreign policy. This created in them a belief, even if tempered by subsequent disappointments, that collective action can change realities, that protest and organization have power, that individuals can make a difference before large systems. This political consciousness sometimes manifests as direct activism, other times as a sense of civic responsibility. People of the 1970s also developed a particular ability for self-entertainment and spontaneous creativity. Without infinite access to professionally produced content, they needed to create their own entertainment. They invented games, told stories, did impromptu theater, created music with simple or even invented instruments. This constant creativity wasn't seen as special talent, but as a normal part of childhood. This developed a mentality where creativity isn't something only artists have, but a fundamental human capacity that everyone can exercise. Another important psychological aspect is the relationship with authority that this generation developed. They grew up at a time of questioning established authorities, but still in structures where hierarchies were clear and respect was expected. This created a productive tension, a capacity to respect legitimate authority while maintaining healthy skepticism and willingness to question when necessary. They are neither automatically rebellious nor automatically submissive, but capable of evaluating situations and responding appropriately. The experience of growing up in generally larger families and more integrated communities also shaped the psychology of this generation. Many of these children had several siblings, close cousins, neighbors who were almost family. They learned early on to negotiate, share, resolve conflicts, coexist with differences. The home wasn't a space where each child had their private room with their devices. It was a shared space where you needed to learn to coexist. This developed robust social skills and an understanding that not everything can be your way, that compromise and cooperation are necessary. There is also a particular emotional resilience that comes from having grown up in an era with fewer formalized psychological support resources. There wasn't the same awareness about mental health, there wasn't the same vocabulary to discuss feelings and traumas. This had challenging aspects, certainly, with many important issues not being adequately addressed. At the same time, people developed their own resilience strategies and learned to navigate emotional difficulties with the resources available at the time. It's important to recognize that both modern advances in mental health and the resilience capacities developed in the past have their value. Reading had a central role in the lives of children of the 1970s in a way that is difficult to imagine today. Books were portals to other worlds, and reading was one of the main forms of entertainment and learning about the world. Children read voraciously, from comic books to classic literature, through encyclopedias just out of curiosity. This deep relationship with reading developed not only linguistic skills and vocabulary, but also capacity for prolonged concentration, complex thinking, empathy through experiencing different perspectives through characters, and a rich inner life. There is also a characteristic of gratitude and appreciation that marks many people of this generation. Because they grew up in a time where not everything was instantly available, where what you had was valued, where small achievements were celebrated, they developed a capacity to appreciate what they have instead of focusing only on what's missing. A new toy was a cause for great joy. A vacation trip was an exceptional event, not an annual expectation. A long-distance phone call was special. This different scale of expectations created people who can find satisfaction in simple things, who don't need constant and intense stimuli to feel happy. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, people who grew up in the 1970s developed a particular perspective on time and change. They lived in a world that transformed so radically that they can perceive both the speed and depth of historical change in a unique way. They have visceral memory of a slower, more analog, more local world. And they also have the experience of adapting to the modern world. This gives them a differentiated temporal perspective, a capacity to see long-term patterns, to understand that what seems permanent can change quickly, that adaptation is possible even when it seems impossible. These psychological characteristics are not universal, of course. Each person is unique, shaped not only by the era in which they grew up, but by family, social class, geography, individual experiences. But there are recognizable patterns, tendencies that mark this generation as a group. They are people who carry within themselves a bridge between two very different worlds, between analog and digital, between local and global, between slow and fast. And in this bridge position, they have something valuable to offer both older and younger generations. Understanding these psychological characteristics is not just an exercise in nostalgia or historical curiosity. It's recognizing that different generations bring different strengths, different perspectives, different wisdoms. People who grew up in the 1970s have much to teach about resilience, about creativity amid resource scarcity, about genuine human connection, about balance between autonomy and community, about adaptability in the face of radical change. In a world that often seems fragmented, anxious, and accelerated to the point of exhaustion, the psychological traits forged in the 1970s can offer alternative paths, reminders of other possible ways of being and existing in the world. May the Lord God bless each of you, and may we all learn from the experiences and wisdom of each generation, honoring the past while we build the future. Thank you for watching.